Hey everybody, it's Tommy Canelli and welcome to Before the Lights podcast, the show that tells you how they made their mark. Today, a former film critic, a best-selling author, community volunteer, podcaster, and blogger. His biographies include Paul Newman, Robert DeNiro, and many others. A former senior editor of the American Film and former associate editor of Box Office. His work has been featured in New York Times, the LA Times, San Francisco Chronicle, Hollywood Reporter, and many more. A New York City native, please welcome to the show, Shawn Levy. Shawn, welcome to Before the Lights.
Hi, thank you. Nice to be here.
You grew up in a showbiz-aware household, but where did your love of writing come from?
You know, my dad, who was by profession a florist, had wanted to be a writer when he was a young man. And he wrote comedy scripts for the radio. He was born in 1928. And I just sort of always had it in my mind that writing was a thing you could do and creating had a value. You know, my dad, he had retail businesses in Brooklyn, New York, and he wrote his own ads for print and radio. And, you know, the cleverness and the wit that always were in his writing, you know, it was something I admired. And when I wrote, and I wrote for a school newspaper starting in grammar school, I got a lot of praise from my folks and from my peers. So it was the sort of thing was like I was a natural and people recognized it. So there was a lot of positive encouragement.
We're going to get to not all of your books, but a few of them, including your brand new one. You went to Lawrence High School in 1974 to 1978. And I understand in New York, there was a place called the Comic Strip that did not check IDs. And you got to see the likes of a young Seinfeld and Eddie Murphy. Can you talk about those times?
Yeah, it was amazing. You know, I skipped a couple of grades. So I was 16 when I graduated high school, and all my friends were about 2 years older than me. And at the time, the drinking age in New York was 18, but the driver's licenses didn't have pictures.
Oh,
so one of the reasons I successfully skipped grades was like I was physically full grown compared to, you know, other kids my age. So I fit in with the kids who were older. And those kids who were like 16 and 17 could pass for 18 and get into these bars. But I was like 14 and 15. And one of the places that was easiest to get into was the Comic Strip on the Upper East Side. And it was the sort of, you know, it was just before the comedy boom. Saturday Night Live was just on the air. You know, we didn't quite have Evening at the Improv on every cable station at the time. And these young comedians in New York, they would perform and then they would hang out at the bar. So you would go in the back room and you would see someone like Jerry Seinfeld, Eddie Murphy, Larry Miller, who you might remember from Pretty Woman. He was the salesman who was rude to Julia Roberts and then turned on the charm when he realized she had money. He was frequently the MC, and he would hang out at the bar and he would introduce you to whoever he was talking to because he came to recognize us. These kids are great. Ha ha. You know, and it was just amazing to see. And I had always had respect for stand-up comedy as a practice because my folks were big fans, and my dad had written some comedy for a comedian named Ronnie. I'm not going to remember. So, you know, to be around these people was amazing. One of my friends, who's now a prominent yoga instructor in Santa Barbara, he went up on the open mic night and flopped epically. And he had a huge cheering section. And for years after, we would go back. It turned out my college roommate lived around the corner from this place. So years later, I would still occasionally go back. And if Larry Miller was emceeing, we would start the chant for this guy from that night. And he never failed to say, "They're back, they're back." So it was a very homey environment, in addition to being a place where a 15-year-old could drink a tequila sunrise.
Sounds like a great time and great memories. In your college years, you started out at the University of Pennsylvania, and then to get your master's in fine arts, you went to UC Irvine. How did you go from Pennsylvania all the way out to Irvine?
You know, at the time I was interested in writing poetry, and poetry is still one of the great loves of my life. I read poetry almost every day. and I still write it. I published a book of poems last year. And in the early 1980s, there were maybe 20 MFA programs in the entire country where you could get a degree writing poetry. Now there are several hundred. I see lists published, the top 100 MFA programs. I'm like, get out of here. And I applied to 4 schools, and the only one that admitted me to the MFA program was UC Irvine. I didn't know where Irvine was on a map. This is 1981. When I applied to the schools, I was actually living abroad. I was living in Barcelona. And I always think that the exotic application, with Spanish stamps was a leg up. But I went to Irvine because they admitted me. I was rejected at Brown. I was rejected at University of Montana, and Syracuse admitted me to their master's program, but not the MFA program. So really, if I wanted to go on, that was my only choice. And it was such a rare, such a narrow field in those days to get an MFA. Now I'm active in the writing community in Portland, Oregon, where I live, and I meet many people with MFAs. But back then, someone with an MFA was a really rare bird.
How did you end up then in Oregon and becoming a film critic?
Well, when I was getting my MFA, I met a girl and we got married and started a family. And she is a 5th generation Oregonian. And in 1992, I had gone from getting my MFA and getting a master's in English literature, the study of literature. And I was on the PhD track, and was not my tempo, as the guy says in Whiplash. I was going to wind up writing a book on a very obscure subject that literally only 3 people would read. And that's just, it's not me. If you know me, that's like, I play to the crowd. And I started working in Hollywood at movie magazines. And the great job that I got at American Film ended when the magazine went out of business. And my then wife finished her PhD. We had 2 kids, no jobs. We were living in Orange County, California, which was not a place either of us had chosen. We were there for grad school and then for my work. So, my family was in New York. That didn't seem like a smart option with no jobs and 2 kids. So we came to Oregon in June of 92 and been here ever since.
You've reviewed over 13,000 films.
300 a year for about 20 years, for sure.
Do you remember the first film you ever reviewed?
I do. It was one of the worst. It's called Little Monsters. I looked it up recently, and it starred Howie Mandel and Fred Savage. And I'm certain that it was given to me because no one else, it was like the unclean thing that no one else in the office wanted to touch. I was at Box Office Magazine. I had done some freelance reviewing before that. There was to get clips that I could then apply to jobs for. But the first time I got paid like American dollars and not coupons to restaurants or something was Little Monsters. So that's about 1987, 88. And it was, I walked out of there thinking, okay, I must be some sort of snob because that's the worst thing I ever saw. And people were coming out of the theater, veteran critics with like appalled looks on their faces and going like, oh my God. So I said, oh, okay, I'm not far off the mark. Thank goodness. And I wrote a review that actually had to be edited back because the editor said some of this might be slander. I had questions about the mental capacity of the people who created it. So.
Do you have a favorite film of all time?
If you're a professional film critic, you get asked that. So I came up with an answer, and my answer is always Chinatown. Roman Polanski's Chinatown. I love detective stories. I love film noir. It's a 70s movie and a 30s movie at the same time. And crucially, I used to see a lot of movies with my dad. We'd watch old movies. He'd turn me on to, the sort of canonical Hollywood movies on TV. And we would go see new movies. And they, my parents were very good with me seeing, I saw The Godfather when I was like 11, The French Connection, things like that, things that were legit R movies. But Chinatown was a movie where my dad and I disagreed. I was about 13 when it came out, and he thought it was bleak and cynical and too derivative. And I was like, no, this is a work of genius. And that that schism between us, difference of opinion, really, I felt was me asserting myself. And years later, my dad passed in 93. But years later, we were talking about Chinatown. And he's like, that really is a great movie. I was like, I told you. So, some days I could say Casablanca. Some days I could say, Mad Max Fury Road. But really, it's Chinatown.
The oldest bookstore in Portland opened in 1938 and unfortunately closed in 2019. Cameron's Books and Magazines, which specialized in obscure nonfiction and vintage periodicals from the mid-19th century. What was it about Cameron's that was just drew people in and you could spend hours there?
Boy, Cameron's is an amazing place. You could go in and say, I'm looking for Life magazine from July 11th, 1974. And there was a damn good chance that they'd have it, like sitting there. And it would only be a couple of bucks. And I got to be friendly with the owners, and they let me into the back room. And it was like Citizen Kane's warehouse at the end of the movie. It just went on and on. It's a rundown block. They shuttered because of COVID, and they were going to lose their lease, but everything is still frozen there. The block, whoever was going to develop that block and tear it down, kind of ran out of funds. So the collection is still sitting in that building. And you would go up these stairs that were like haunted house stairs. They were rickety, and it was hard because there were piles of magazines. But, I did a book in 2016 called Dolce Vita Confidential about Rome in the 50s and the birth of the paparazzi and the movie gossip culture around that and fashion. And I was able to go into Cameron's Books and say, do you have any Italian magazines? Oh, yeah. And the guy takes me up the stairs and we go. And there was like a pile of magazines. And he just let me sift through them. And I found 5 or 6 things that were like, I was reading about them in books in Italian. And I'm sure if I went to a library in Italy, I could not get my hands on this thing. And it's sitting there in a pile in a room in Portland, Oregon. So, Cameron's, I like to think that they're going to win the lottery and reopen, at least hold on to the collection and make it, put it online, make it available for purchase or looking, because it's a remarkable place.
When did you decide to write biographies, and how did you choose the first one?
As I mentioned, the magazine that I worked for, American Film, closed at the end of 1991, and I thought, okay, I can write books. I wrote for the magazine, but I was also an assigning editor, and a lot of the writers who I used regularly were authors. So I had an idea for a book. I had been to Spain in the spring of 1991 to visit the set of a Pedro Almodovar film and write a story about him. And I thought, I'd like to do a splashy, sexy, colorful book about Pedro Almodovar. And I spoke to a few of my writers, my stable of writers who worked for me, and a couple of them recommended book agents. And one guy in particular said, my agent would not be interested in this, but you want to work with my agent. And I was like, well, not if he doesn't like my ideas. I found 2 agents who were interested. I happened to go to New York that summer and 92, spoke to them, chose one to work with, and she couldn't get anyone interested in a book on Pedro Almodovar. But one publisher said, we like this guy's writing. Ask him if he's interested in writing a book on Spencer Tracy. I was like, Spencer Tracy, great actor, but what's the life? His life was acting, drinking, having this affair with Katharine Hepburn. And it seemed to me for a biography, you wanted someone with a more varied story. So I said to this agent, before you tell them, no, I'm not interested in Spencer Tracy, let me give them a short list of people who I would be interested in. And there was enough of an internet in 1992 that I could get online to the UCLA card catalog, because UCLA has a huge film library. And I started just throwing names at it, seeing is there a biography of it? And the people I thought of were Peter O'Toole, Peter Lorre, Paul Newman, and then a little birdie said to me, Jerry Lewis. And there were books on those other guys, but there was nothing on Jerry Lewis. And I called the agent back. I said, I've got it. And I did some research, wrote a proposal, and The Spencer Tracy people didn't want it, but the next people did. And I wound up writing the biography of Jerry Lewis as my first book. Still like to do that Almodovar someday.
That's The King of Comedy, The Life and Art of Jerry Lewis, which is one of the books I wanted to talk to you about. Shawn, can you talk about the amount of research you did for this book and actually talking to Jerry himself, who at one point was the highest paid performer in history?
Yeah, Jerry Lewis was a record-setting earner in film, radio, television, and Broadway. And, technically it's not him, but his charity fundraising for the Muscular Dystrophy Association was in the billions of dollars, sort of single-handedly. He was just an immense star from 1948 to about 1968, one of the biggest stars in Hollywood. And then, once you've hit that inner circle, you may fade, but you're never gone. And he hung on until his death. God, when was it? 2017? He was in 2018, 2019. He was 90 something when he passed. And I reached out to Jerry. I reached out to a bunch of people who had worked with Jerry. Again, this is pre-email. So you had to write letters to people and put them in the U.S. post box.
Put a stamp on the letter and put it in the mailbox.
Yeah. And, I sent 40 or 50 letters to all kinds of people who had crisscrossed with Jerry. And I went to the New York Public Library and which has a great clippings collection in the Lincoln Center Library. There's a performing arts research branch there. And you can go in and say, whoever, James Dean, James Franco, and they'll pull out these big, accordion folders filled with clippings, like actual physical clippings of interviews and news. And you can really build a sort of timeline with that. And then I learned that Jerry had donated his papers to the University of Southern California, where he taught briefly in the early 1970s. And I went there to USC and I turned every page. So I had like this great timeline that I put together from the two libraries, one in Beverly Hills, one in New York, the clippings. I had Jerry's business papers, which gave me the story behind the story. I spoke to dozens of people, and then I had 2 long interviews with Jerry himself and several phone and even U.S. mail exchanges with him. So I had everything. I learned about things that we couldn't publish. Jerry was alive. He became hostile to the project. I learned about a daughter he'd had that was with a woman other than his wife. I learned about women he'd had affairs with or sort of pushed himself on sexually. Women who worked for him, actresses. Once I started asking questions, people would say, "Oh, you need to talk to my friend so-and-so." And it wasn't necessarily someone we'd ever heard of, but they could show me, look, I got this letter from Jerry. And it was like, it was like, I don't want to call it a love letter. It was I think the old fashioned term was a mash note, because it was like, in some cases it was uninvited attention and he had been told no, but he persisted. So some of those stories are coming out now. I couldn't publish them in 1996 because Jerry was just waiting with his finger on the button to sue us. But, you can't sue over things that are true. Mm-hmm. And the absolute worst things in that book are right out of Jerry's mouth. So, that was our defense. You did this stuff and you said this stuff. So take us to court. You'll help us sell books.
He influenced the likes of Woody Allen, David Letterman, and Jim Carrey and others. But some people say he really wasn't a talented comedian. He was a mimic. In your mind, what was he?
Oh, he was a great talent, a physical comic, a vocal comic. He combined aspects of like Harpo Marx, the surreal. He was a man. He'd come out on stage when he was with Dean Martin, the two of them elegantly dressed in Cy Devore tuxedos. And Dean would walk up and start crooning in that suave way of his, and Jerry would act like a 4-year-old who had just eaten like 3 bowls of sugar pops and was like bouncing off the walls with a squeaky voice, just doing completely inappropriate things. And there was raw comedy. One of my favorite quotes in the book, I never interviewed Orson Welles, but Peter Bogdanovich, who passed recently, the great director and actor, told me that Orson Welles said the funniest thing he ever saw live on a stage was Dean Martin and Jerry Lewis at the Copacabana in the late 1940s. And Dean was a brilliant comic and a brilliant straight man, but it took Jerry to bring him out of, his kind of wisecracking shell and make him warm and approachable. And Dean, standing next to Jerry, was sort of like, this guy is too much, but with me next to him, that kind of brings the level, the temperature down to where, you can stand to have him in the room. Jerry was also a great director of comedy. He innovated, on every film set in the world today, you watch a monitor that show, and you can capture a take. So we rehearse the scene and we film it, but we record it. And then the actor and directors and DP, the director of photography, might watch the take again to say, okay, we'll change it this. Yeah, hit that mark, read the line that way. Well, that didn't exist in 1960, but Jerry Lewis wanted it. So we had the engineers in the camera department at Paramount rig something up. And first it was live only, so he could see what the camera saw. There was a tiny camera under the main camera and a little closed circuit screen that he could watch. And then after a year or two, they figured out a way to record what the camera saw so he could see it and be assured, because he was often directing himself, he could be assured that what the camera got was what he wanted. And he invented that, and his physical comedy, his movies like The Bellboy was his first film, The Ladies' Man, The Errand Boy, and The Nutty Professor, those first 5 or 6 films that he directed are really great American comedies. But he was playing to an audience that was shrinking in the early 1960s. Once the Beatles came over and the kids had their thing and the adults had their thing, the old time entertainers were playing to smaller and smaller audiences, and youth culture began to dominate at the box office, on the radio, etc. People like Jerry, Frank Sinatra, Sammy Davis Jr., Dean Martin, they were still around, and they were still big, but the stage that they were on was shrinking beneath them.
Listeners, I'm going to put a link in the show notes to where you can get your hands and purchase Shawn's books, and I highly recommend you do so. The 1998 bestseller, Rat Pack Confidential, Frank, Dean, Sammy, Peter, Joey, and the Last Great Showbiz Party. This includes actors, comics, singers, gangsters, politicians, women, and Vegas in 1960. If you're not really understanding and you don't know the background of Frank Sinatra, this book may change your perspective on who Frank Sinatra really was. But in your mind, Shawn, was it really Frank's world?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. In 1960, it sure was. There was a New Yorker cartoon of a guy, sort of moping. He's on a couch and he's looking sad and he's got a newspaper in his hand and his wife is saying, "And what makes you think Frank Sinatra and all those guys are so much fun anyhow?" They were the post-war American ideal of male camaraderie. Today we would think male privilege and patriarchal, see it, take it, throw it away attitude. True, they were misogynists, and even though they were considered progressive on the question of civil rights, the humor that they indulged in is more than cringy today. It's objectionable. But Sammy Davis Jr. was there and taking part in it, and that kind of complicated it. Frank Sinatra could convene the biggest stars in Hollywood, the biggest recording stars, the president of the United States, and the heads of mafia families at a party, at a hotel in Las Vegas that he was a co-owner of. If that's not the definition of being king of the world, it's darn close. It'll certainly do. There was a moment in the early 60s, Frank had his own record label, Reprise, and he sold it to Warner Brothers. And in the deal, he was going to get $1 million, like cash, among the other things. And they wrote him a check, Warner Brothers, Frank Sinatra, $1 million, and he carried around in his pocket for a week or three. And he would just casually take it out and say to someone, "You want to see something? You and I get a check for $1 million. You better not be between me and that bank.
That's right.
It's going right in the bank, and I'm not leaving until it credits." You know, Frank Sinatra walked around and he used to joke, "That's what I call pocket money."
Unbelievable. The book is fascinating. I thoroughly enjoyed it, Shawn.
Oh, thank you.
But they had Vegas, they had money, they had the mob, they had politicians. What was the dark side?
Well, the dark side was they had Vegas, money, the mob, and politicians. I mean, Frank Sinatra introduced a woman named Judith Campbell. She was the ex-wife of a small-time actor, and she was kind of a mixed-up party girl. She was an attractive young woman. She looked a bit like Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis. At the famous summit at the Sands, when the Rat Pack shot the movie Ocean's 11 and performed every night 2 shows on the stage of the Copa Room at the Sands, Frank introduced Judy Campbell, who he had been sleeping with, to Sam Giancana, the head of the Chicago mob, and John Kennedy, then running for the Democratic nomination for the presidency. And she carried on affairs with those 2 men simultaneously. Sinatra connected the mob to the Kennedys during the primaries in West Virginia, during the general election in Illinois. Mobsters wanted the Kennedy administration to stop the investigations into organized crime that had been going on during the Eisenhower years. In fact, the Kennedys ramped them up. Bobby Kennedy as Attorney General. Bobby didn't like Frank Sinatra. He thought Frank was a bad influence on his brother. Frank didn't like Bobby. He thought Bobby was a prig, even though he knew about Bobby's extramarital activities. There was just a lot of nasty stuff. You know, Frank and Dean Martin were part owners of the Sands. And they were said to own 8 or 10% of the hotel. It's almost certain that 90% of their ownership was actually covering up for gangsters in Kansas City and Chicago. I mean, there's no books, like no ledgers that show that, but it was a known thing. And when I was working on the book, the Sands was in its final days.
Oh,
so I stayed at the Sands Hotel for literally the last 10 days that it was open. And I was fortunate because the guy who had access to all the paper archives says, "Yeah, that stuff's all getting thrown out. So if there's anything you want, just go and look." So I could sit in the offices of the Sands and go through everything. I found people who had worked there. The Sands opened in 1954-ish, and it closed in 1996, 97. And I found people who had worked there for all 43 years. And they were going to lose their jobs. They had started working there, when they were 20 or something, and now they're in their mid 60s. And they, the hotel was going to be torn down. It's now the Venetian. And they were told, "Oh yeah, you can apply for your old jobs." Well, that was going to be in another 3 or 5 years by the time that hotel got built. And they were like, "They're not going to hire me back. I'm 70 years old. What are they want young people dealing cards." And, one of the guys who'd worked there the entire time was a guy named Mike Cohn, whose brother Carl Cohn ran the Sands Casino and answered directly to mobsters back east. He told me all about his brother. And Mike had been dealing blackjack at the Sands for decades. And he said, well, someone introduced me to him. He was about to go on a shift dealing. And he said, "Well, come meet me at this table in 2 hours. I'll be off. And the table will be closed." So I come to the table and he's sitting there out with me. We're both on the stools where the gamblers would sit. And as he's talking, he stands up and he goes around the table to the dealer's side. And I realized, oh, this guy is so used to talking to people with a blackjack table between him and them that this is like his comfort zone. So I just, the conversation continued, and I didn't say anything about that, but it was just so obvious that this guy had spent 40 years behind the table. He felt exposed when he was out front.
I love that backstory because I live in Vegas. I love the old stories of Vegas. I love that stuff. This is my story. No symptoms to being diagnosed with colon cancer, which led to 4 surgeries and a 50-50 survival rate. It then spread to my liver, in which only 3% are caught in time. Now, a 1% chance it ever comes back. And I'm on the road to inspiring everyone, because you have 3 choices: live, die, or fight. Bernie Siegel said, no matter what the statistics say, there's always a way. To book me, Tommy Canale, to speak to your event or group, go to TommyCanale.com. That's TommyCanale.com. And get ready to be inspired to inspire others, because you're one day away from changing your life. Click the link in the show notes. You had mentioned, we were talking about Cameron's, that you did a book in 2016, Dolce Vita Confidential. It was Book of the Year by The Spectator and Irish Examiner, named Sunday Times Stage and Screen Book of the Year. What was it that made Rome the epicenter of film? What's the attraction there?
There are a couple of reasons. After World War II, one of the ways that the United States helped the countries in Europe recover from the devastation that they had was, if American companies made money in Europe, they had to spend that money in Europe, like a certain portion, like 75% of your European income needed to be invested in Europe. So for car companies, say, Ford and GM would take on a sister company in Germany or France or England. For the film people, that meant they had all this money and they had to make movies or build things in Europe. It happened that Benito Mussolini was a big movie buff, and he sent his son to America in the 1920s to get autographs from a couple of movie stars that he liked, but also to study the American studio system and see how it was that it worked, as if it was, the petrochemical industry or the automobile industry. Like, what does a movie studio look like? And outside of Rome, he built a studio called Cinecittà, Cinema City. And it is at the time, it was the largest studio outside of California anywhere in the world. And during the war, Cinecittà was not bombed because it was being used to house people who'd lost their homes, and everyone knew that. Like, this is not it looks like military, but it's not. It's a refugee camp. And after the war, production started again at Cinecittà, and American movie studios had all this money that was stuck in Europe because of the Marshall Plan contingencies. So someone got the idea, was like, these guys, they know how to make movies. They've got these gigantic sound stages. They have these wonderful craftspeople, and they're really good at like Bible stories and gladiator stories. So they started making movies like Quo Vadis, Ben-Hur, and they were like, this is a great place to work. It's cheap. All these craftspeople, the dressmakers, the set decorators, the camera people, they all know what they're doing. Their craft is as good as the American. So now more people started going over there, and they made films like Roman Holiday. And, later on it becomes crazy. A Gidget Goes to Rome. But simultaneous to that, Italian fashion and style were taking over. Italians were the first people where the haute couture designers made everyday clothes. So today, you go to the store and you're going to see like the expensive Chanel and maybe like the cheap that you can wear, or Halston, the high end and the street. That started in Rome and Florence in the 50s. So it was a fashion destination, it was a movie destination, and then there were these young guys with cameras who didn't have a name. They called themselves assault photographers, and they would take pictures of Judy Garland on the Spanish Steps or Orson Welles buying a newspaper on Via Veneto. And a couple of times they caught people coming out of nightclubs, and perhaps with someone to whom they weren't married. And the people would like they get a rise out of these people. And those pictures started becoming very popular all around the world. So these assault photographers made it a game. Let's catch Ava Gardner coming out of this hotel with Tony Franciosa. Let's go after this guy who's always drunk and has a hot temper. And after a while, these people, because of a movie that Federico Fellini made, in which there was a photographer character named Paparazzo, which was it's meant to evoke the sound of a buzzing fly, became known as paparazzi. And that's where that started. So all of that together. And the look and feel of Rome in the 50s. I'd written a book on the Rat Pack, and I wrote a book about London in the swinging 60s, which is the thing after the Rat Pack, basically like the Beatles in ties to the Beatles breaking up, and all the fashion and music and lifestyle that went on there. And I thought, well, what preceded the Rat Pack? And it was Rome in the 50s. And it took me about 20 years to get someone to agree to pay me to write that book. So I gathered string on it and did research in Rome, which was amazing. Like I'd be, walking to the library past the Colosseum. It was like, I went to Cinecittà and I saw Fellini's sound stages and the places where these movies were made. It was spectacular.
It's on my list to read. It definitely has my attention, and definitely going to give this a read. October 2021, A Year in the Life of Death, poems inspired by the obituary pages of the New York Times. From the year 2016, which claims some of the world's most iconic figures, where did this concept come from?
I'm a journalist and a biographer. So the obituary, where you get the entire life in one page overnight, the guy dies on Tuesday, on Wednesday, the obituaries in the paper. That really appeals to me. And the New York Times obituaries are the best in the United States, I feel, published regularly in a newspaper. There's great ones in London as well. The Guardian does beautiful obituaries. And I was writing poetry. I had laid off poetry for a while. I started going to writing workshops led by Lydia Yuknavitch, the novelist. And my partner is a novelist, and she encouraged me to attend these things. And when I sat down to do creative writing, poetry came out, because that's my first love as a writer. And like I say, I read it all the time. And I was at an event where a friend of mine read an essay that she wrote that was based on an obituary that she'd read that week in the New York Times. And I went up to her later and I said, I clipped that same obituary. It was by Norman Mailer's second or third wife. I can't even remember what number. The one whom he stabbed at a party in New York when she cast aspersions on his sexuality and his books. And he stabbed her in front of a cocktail party full of people. And we got to talking about Adele Mailer. Adele Morales was her maiden name. And in my head, I said, I bet there's a poem about her. In fact, I bet there's a poem every day in the New York Times obituary section. He said, not knowing what he was talking about. So I said, I'm going to do this for a year. I'm going to wake up every day, read the Times obituaries, and try and find a poem. And I started this around, Thanksgiving 2015. And 2016 was my goal year. And in 2016, everybody died. It started with David Bowie, Prince, Merle Haggard, George Michael, Glenn Frey, Debbie Reynolds, Carrie Fisher, Nancy Reagan, Antonin Scalia, John Glenn, Fidel Castro. In 2 weeks, Muhammad Ali, Gordie Howe, and Arnold Palmer. Every day you woke up and there was like a famous person on the front page. In fact, the Times did an article that year and said, no, it's not your imagination. More famous people, more A1 obituaries this year than any other year that we've recorded. And how do you write a poem about John Glenn or Muhammad Ali, or Leonard Cohen? So it took me years to do all the writing. I started in real time in late 2015. I didn't finish the book until 2020, 2021. I decided there would be 100 poems. Because my brain works in round numbers like that. There were also very personal things. Both of my parents are gone, and there were people who died who my parents had been interested in or knew about. Ralph Branca, the pitcher who threw the Brooklyn Dodgers pitcher who threw the pitch that Bobby Thompson hit for the famous home run in 1951, broke my father's heart. He died that year. The fellow who started Junior's restaurant in Brooklyn with the famous Junior's cheesecake. There's a family legend about I was born a few blocks from Junior's. And while my mom was in labor, my father ran to the restaurant and got a sliced cheesecake for her. So it's like, this is the last thing I ate when I was still in the womb, you know? And then there was a good friend of mine died that year, Catherine Dunn, the novelist, who was a longtime Portlander and a very dear friend who I'd seen just a few weeks before she passed. So the book became very personal too. And it's constructed like a newspaper. It starts with A1 and the front page, then below the fold, then also in the news, then an art section and a sports section and a classified and a personal. So it speaks to a lot of things that I love. And you know, it's my pandemic baby. It came out in October of 2021 and we thought we would be able to promote it, but we were in the midst of, I don't even remember which variant. And so, you know, I still trot it out when I can. You know, I dearly love it. It was great. I got no advance. You know, a book that I wrote for nothing cost me money, and was able to tell my agent. You know, I have a wonderful agent, not the first one I worked with, the one who I was told early on, this guy's not going to be interested in this idea. He's been my agent now for almost 30 years, and the contract said the author will receive an advance of $0. And I said, you are not to push back on that. You know? This is a true labor of love. So that's the story of that book. It's, you know, I was thinking it's my mom. It happens to be my mom's birthday today. She's gone 11 years. And I always think of what news I would share with her. I was like, oh, by the way, I finally published a book of poetry. Can you believe it?
2022, the latest book, In on the Joke, the original queens of stand-up comedy. Shawn, how difficult did women find it to be recognized as a stand-up comedian? And did some even have to change their names?
Oh, yeah. Almost all comedians prior to 1970, say, operated under some kind of stage name, men and women. But, you know, women had this tremendous psychological barrier of audiences. They did not expect women to be funny. If they were funny, it was because they were stupid. And there was a type in vaudeville, the dumb Dora. And the most famous dumb Dora in vaudeville was Gracie Allen, who worked with George Burns. But if you know Lucille Ball and Desi Arnaz, Lucille is playing the dumb Dora. You know, she, you know, things make sense to her that are nonsense when you and I hear them. And, you know, they couldn't be attractive if they were funny. They'd have to dress as clowns. If you watch The Marvelous Mrs. Maisel, the character played by Jane Lynch, Sophie Lennon, you know, she's a frump. And she, you know, pretends to be this housewife from Queens, like the honeymooners Queens, you know, like, you know, just sort of dishwater and, you know, mopping floors all day and talking, you know, in a heavy New York accent. And off stage, she's an elegant woman, you know, who has a butler and a Rolls Royce. And that's what it was like for women comedians, including the successful ones. Moms Mabley, who was performed at the Apollo more times than anyone else. And on Black Showbiz, she was pretending to be an old granny when she was in her 30s. Minnie Pearl, who was in the Grand Ole Opry for almost 50 years and on Hee Haw and played state fairs and county fairs all over the country for decades. She was a college-educated woman who pretended to be a country rube with the price tag hanging off her hat and chasing fellas, and she was happily married for, you know, almost her whole life. You know, Phyllis Diller, who came up in the 50s, was a conventionally attractive woman who had to put on a fright wig and garish makeup and the craziest clothes and cackle like a hyena. In the late 60s, when she was a superstar, Hugh Hefner thought it would be funny to photograph her for Playboy because she was the hag. And, you know, one of her jokes, you know, I love going to the doctor because it's the only place a man will say to me, take off your clothes. And so they took some nudes of her and they couldn't use them because she had an attractive physique. And even though she was a mother of 5 and in her 40s, they said, this is not going to work. It's actually, you're sexy. So like there was a tremendous struggle when Joan Rivers is truly a breakthrough figure. And in 1965, when she appeared on the Tonight Show with Johnny Carson and became an overnight star, the New York Times went to review her at the nightclub where she was playing in New York. And it was a positive review. And it began by comparing women comedians to woman shot putters. And I was like, oh my God. I mean, you couldn't, if you did that in a newsroom today, the next site would be you with your belongings in a box going to the elevator.
Right.
And in 1965, that was considered a compliment. So that's what, my book ends with Joan Rivers. So it really has to do before the comedy boom. And many of the women who are alive and performing today or have even retired, like Elaine Boozler and Lisa Lampanelli, no longer do comedy. But it's before that generation, because these are women who they not only blaze a trail, they were the first ones even to think there should be a trail.
Where was Mary Tyler Moore? Where does she fall in there?
She's a comic actress. She never stood, I had very strict requirements for who would fit into this book. And it had to be a comedian who stood up alone in front of a microphone, withstood hecklers, worked with one-liners or stories that ended in one-liners. And Mary Tyler Moore, who's brilliantly funny on the Dick Van Dyke Show and then on her own show and many movies, also a great serious actress. She's just, she never performed. The showbiz vernacular is performing in one, like by yourself on the stage. Mary Tyler Moore does appear in my poetry book. She died in early 2017. She's the last poem in the book.
Let's shift from the books into something else. And I do a lot of research and I've heard you talk about this. So when I heard this, I got excited because I'm like, somebody that I can actually have this conversation with. People think I'm crazy when I bring up the fact that Ronald Reagan was an FBI informant and actually ratted out women who turned down his advances at cocktail parties. You agree with this?
Yes, that's true. There's a book called Subversives, and it's about the FBI's efforts to undermine the student protests in California, the free speech protests at Berkeley and the other California campuses in the Bay Area in the 1960s. And that author, using the Freedom of Information Act, got Ronald Reagan's confidential file from the FBI, and it is vast. Hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pages from before he was governor. He was the president of the Screen Actors Guild. He testified in front of Congress during the House Un-American Activity Committee investigation into communists in the movie business. And he volunteered to be a source for the FBI about unsavory goings-on. And he was divorced from Jane Wyman in the mid-1940s, late 1940s, partly because she was tired of his politics. And he started dating. And he was a skirt chaser during that time. This is before he met Nancy. And there were women who turned him down, who literally he would the next day make a call to the FBI office and says, I think you want to look into this person because last night I met her at a party and she was saying some, things that might be considered anti-government or anti-American. He turned in union leaders, people who worked like on the, in the backstage unions, not the Screen Actors Guild, but things like the electricians and the Teamsters and, stuff like that. And, it was at the time, he did not think he was going to be governor of California or president of the United States. And by the time he got to those offices, he was no longer providing these services, but he didn't have to because Hoover had him in his back pocket. And
isn't there also some connection to where there's a connection from Al Capone to get him to be president of the Screen Actors Guild?
That's right. This all comes from work I'm doing on Lew Wasserman, who was the most powerful man in Hollywood for decades. And Wasserman ran the MCA talent agency. And one of his first clients in Hollywood, one of MCA's first clients, was Ronald Reagan, who was a radio announcer trying to break into movies. And he did break into movies, mainly playing radio announcers. But he had a great voice. He had a great screen presence. He wasn't much of an actor, but he when he's on screen in these cheapo B movies, he's the most charismatic one. Wasserman worked for a man named Jules Stein, who created the Music Corporation of America, MCA, which was a booking agency for big bands back in the 20s. And Jules Stein literally worked for Al Capone. And Lew Wasserman was in their orbit. I don't know that Wasserman ever shook Capone's hand, but his boss did. And the office had maybe 4 people in it when Wasserman joined it. And they stayed connected to the mob always until the 1950s or 60s. MCA came out to California and supported the efforts of a couple of union organizers named Bioff and Brown, who were basically thumb breakers sent out by the Chicago mob to take over the unions in the movie business. The LA mob was very weak and their territory was up for grabs. Las Vegas didn't exist yet. And these guys came out and they were like, you see scenes of this in the movie Hoffa with Jack Nicholson as Jimmy Hoffa.
Yeah.
There are strikes, and then these guys come rolling out of cars with sticks. You see it in The Wire also, and in The Sopranos. Job sites and protests being busted up by heavy guys with baseball bats and tire irons. And that's what they did, and they wound up being convicted. But that they paved the way for MCA to take over a lot of union business, including the Screen Actors Guild. And when Ronald Reagan's movie career was in the decline in the late 1940s, Lew Wasserman, the head of MCA, suggested to him, you know what you would be good at? You would be good at being president of the Screen Actors Guild. And when Reagan was president of the Screen Actors Guild, he made a sweetheart deal. He gave MCA the right, uniquely among Hollywood talent agencies, to both represent talent and produce television shows. So I'm the producer. I want to hire you as the actor. I want to pay $1. I want to pay the least. I'm the agent. I want to sell you to the producer. I want $1 million. But if I'm the agent and I own the TV show, it behooves me to sell you for the $1. And by the way, take 15 cents as my commission. And MCA, unique among talent agencies, got that deal from the Screen Actors Guild when Reagan was president. And it was such an obviously crooked deal that the U.S. Justice Department looked into it. And Ronald Reagan had to appear in front of a grand jury in 1961 or 62. And he gave like 50 pages of testimony. Reagan was not a mobster. Probably he met some bad guys, because when you're a celebrity, you do. But he worked for guys who definitely knew mobsters. And that continued into the 1970s. Sidney Korshak, the mob's lawyer in Las Vegas and LA, was Lew Wasserman's constant lunch companion when Lew Wasserman was running Universal Studios. So that didn't die with Al Capone. It stayed for 50, 60 years.
Listeners, I can't urge you enough. Go to the link in the show notes and go check out Shawn's books. Go purchase 1, purchase 2, purchase them all. Shawn won't care if you get them all, including make sure you get the one that's more dear to his heart, A Year in the Life of Death, the poems. Check that one out as well. Shawn, thanks so much for coming on the show. I have really enjoyed this.
Thanks very much, Tommy. I appreciate your interest.
Listeners, follow me on Instagram at Before the Lights Podcast. And if you would, take a couple minutes out of your day, follow and rate and review the show. 5 stars, nice comments are always appreciated. Thank you for listening to Before the Lights. I'm Tommy Canale. And until next time, everybody, I salute a chin chin.